Margaret Hale was 76 years old, and for most of her life, she believed happiness was made of small things. Before we begin next, take a moment to subscribe our channel. Not grand things, not expensive things. Small things? The sound of a kettle beginning to whistle before sunrise. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery 3 streets away. The soft golden curtains in her kitchen that glowed every morning when sunlight slipped through them like warm honey. She lived in a modest little house at the edge of a quiet town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's name. The house wasn't remarkable. Its paint had faded years ago. The fence leaned slightly to one side. The porch steps creaked. But to Margaret, it was the most beautiful place in the world. Every corner carried a memory. Her husband Arthur had planted the climbing roses beside the front door nearly 48 years earlier. The roses still bloomed every spring as faithfully as they had when he first knelt in the soil with dirt beneath his fingernails and hope in his heart. Arthur used to joke that the flowers were more dependable than people. Margaret always laughed when he said it. Now, even years later, she could still hear his laughter echoing through the rooms. Some sounds never truly disappear. Every morning she woke at 6, not because she had to, because after 70 years of routine, her body simply knew. She would make coffee, feed the birds outside her kitchen window, water the roses, then sit on the porch with a blanket over her knees while the world slowly woke around her. Children passed on bicycles. Neighbors waved. Dogs barked. Life moved gently, peacefully. Margaret liked it that way. She never wanted excitement. She wanted consistency. The kind of life that felt like a favorite song. Predictable, comforting, beautiful. Her daughter Emily lived several hours away with her own family. They spoke every Sunday, never missed a week. Margaret looked forward to those calls more than she admitted. Sometimes after hanging up, she would sit quietly in her chair and smile for no reason at all. The house felt less empty afterward. Loneliness was a strange thing. You learned how to carry it, like an old coat, heavy at first, then familiar. After Arthur passed away 8 years earlier, Margaret thought she would never recover. 49 years together, almost half a century. Entire lifetimes lived side by side. She had forgotten how to be a single person, forgotten how to eat at a table set for one, forgotten how silent evenings could become. But slowly she adapted, not because she wanted to, because life kept moving, and she moved with it. She volunteered twice a week at the local library. She baked pies for neighbors. She wrote letters, real letters, the kind written by hand, the kind people rarely sent anymore. Margaret believed every person deserved to feel remembered. Maybe because she feared being forgotten herself? Years passed gently, like pages turning. Then one rainy afternoon in late autumn, a letter arrived, a simple white envelope. Nothing unusual about it, at least not at first. Margaret almost ignored it, almost left it unopened on the kitchen table. But something about it felt strange. The paper, the handwriting, the unfamiliar return address. A small chill moved through her. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Inside, the clock ticked. Steady, patient, waiting. Margaret opened the envelope, and without realizing it, she stepped onto a path that would change everything she thought she knew about her life. The letter came from a financial company she had never heard of. At first, she assumed it was junk mail, a mistake, some advertisement. But as she continued reading, confusion tightened in her chest. The company informed her that an old investment account linked to her late husband had fallen into legal review. Several documents required immediate attention. Failure to respond could result in serious consequences. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then 4, then 5. The words refused to make sense. Arthur handled finances, always had. Even after his death, Margaret simply continued following the systems he left behind. Bills were paid, taxes were filed. Nothing seemed unusual. Until now. The next morning, she called the number. A young man answered, polite, professional, detached. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet, by the time it ended, Margaret's hands were shaking. There was debt, a tremendous amount of debt, more than she could comprehend. Apparently, an investment Arthur made years earlier had collapsed. Complicated legal disputes followed. Interest accumulated, documents were misplaced, errors were made. Now the final responsibility had reached her. Margaret sat in silence after the call. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. The air heavier, the familiar walls seemed distant. There must be a mistake. There had to be. Arthur was careful, meticulous, responsible. He would never leave something like this behind. Would he? Weeks passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and phone calls. Each conversation delivered worse news. The debt was real. The numbers were undeniable. And because of technicalities Margaret barely understood, she was legally responsible. The savings she and Arthur spent decades building vanished first. Then her retirement funds. Then almost everything else. Margaret never cried in front of anyone. Not once. She thanked people for their help, nodded politely, signed papers, asked thoughtful questions, then returned home and sat quietly in Arthur's chair. The chair no one else ever used. The chair that still smelled faintly of cedar wood. And there she would stare at nothing for hours, trying to understand how an entire lifetime could unravel so quickly. Winter arrived early that year. Cold winds rattled the windows. Snow gathered along sidewalks. Christmas lights appeared across town, yet Margaret barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to survival. The final blow came 3 months later. She lost the house Arthur built, the house where Emily took her first steps, the house filled with birthdays and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesdays that now seemed priceless. Margaret packed her belongings alone, box after box. Memory after memory. Every object carried a story. Every room carried a piece of her heart. Neighbors offered help. She thanked them, but she preferred solitude. Grief felt easier in silence. On the final evening, she walked through each room, slowly, carefully, touching walls, touching door frames, touching memories. When she reached the front porch, she stopped beside Arthur's roses. Snow rested on the petals, tiny crystals shimmering beneath moonlight. Margaret knelt beside them. Her aging knees protested. She didn't care. For a long moment, she simply looked at the flowers. Then she whispered something only the roses could hear, and walked away. The apartment she moved into was small. 1 bedroom. Thin walls, a view of a parking lot. No garden, no porch, no roses. Some nights she sat beside the window and watched strangers come and go, people with places to be, people with families waiting, people who still belonged somewhere. She ate simple meals, soup, bread, tea. Sometimes she counted coins before buying groceries. Sometimes she skipped meals without mentioning it. Pride can be a stubborn companion. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Margaret opened her wallet. Inside were $17. 17. That was all. She stared at the money for a very long time, then quietly placed the wallet on the table. For the first time in her life, she felt truly defeated. Not sad, not frightened, defeated. The difference mattered, because sadness eventually passes. Fear eventually fades. Defeat settles into your bones. That night, she sat in darkness, no television, no music, no distractions, only silence, The kind of silence that forces you to listen to your own thoughts. And those thoughts were not kind. She wondered whether her life had already reached its final chapter, whether anything meaningful remained, whether anyone would remember her after she was gone. Hours passed. Rain tapped against the glass. Margaret closed her eyes, and for one terrible moment, she almost stopped caring what happened next. But then she remembered something. A memory. Tiny, insignificant, yet strangely powerful. Arthur's voice. Soft, warm, from decades earlier. If life knocks you down, he had once told her while planting roses, stay down long enough to catch your breath, then stand up again. Margaret opened her eyes. Slowly, the apartment was still small. The debt was still real. The future was still uncertain. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. A tiny spark remained, barely visible, but alive. She didn't know it yet. Neither did anyone else. But somewhere hidden among forgotten memories and secrets buried for half a century, a discovery was waiting. A discovery that would soon turn her entire world upside down. If you like this story, press like button so more people like you will watch story. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Margaret woke before sunrise, not because she had slept well, but because sleep had become difficult these days. Worries seemed to grow louder after midnight. They sat beside her bed like unwelcome guests and whispered until dawn. She wrapped herself in a worn cardigan and made tea. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Once silence had felt peaceful, now it felt enormous. She carried her cup to the window and watched raindrops slide down the glass. Cars moved through the parking lot. Headlights reflected on wet pavement. Somewhere a dog barked. Life continued. Even when your own world felt frozen. Later that afternoon, Margaret decided to sort through several boxes she had never fully unpacked after leaving her house. Most contained ordinary things. Photo albums, old dishes, Christmas decorations, letters from Emily when she was a child, memories packed in cardboard. She wasn't searching for anything in particular. She simply needed something to do, something to keep her mind from wandering toward dark places. Hours passed. Dust floated through pale sunlight. One box led to another. Then another. Near the bottom of a faded wooden trunk, she discovered a small leather case. She frowned. The case looked familiar, yet she couldn't immediately remember where it came from. The leather was cracked with age. The brass clasp had tarnished green. Margaret turned it over in her hands. A strange feeling settled over her. Not fear. Not exactly. More like recognition. The sensation that something forgotten was trying to remember itself. Carefully, she opened the clasp. Inside were documents. Old documents. Very old. The paper had yellowed with time. Some pages were folded. Others were tied together with a thin blue ribbon. Margaret adjusted her glasses and began reading. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Property records. Receipts, insurance papers. Then she found an envelope. Unlike everything else, this envelope was sealed. On the front, written in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. For Margaret, open Sunday. Margaret's breath caught. The room suddenly felt still. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, a single sheet. Arthur's handwriting filled both sides. She stared at it for several seconds before reading. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then life has probably surprised you again. It always does. You were never fond of surprises, but somehow you always handled them better than anyone I ever knew. There is something I never told you, not because I didn't trust you. Because I promised someone I wouldn't. For 50 years, I kept that promise. Now I think it's time for the truth. Margaret stopped reading. Her heart pounded. Arthur had never kept secrets from her, not important ones. Not for 50 years. She continued. The letter described events from long before they met, long before marriage, long before Emily, long before the life they built together. When Arthur was 23, he worked briefly for an elderly man named Samuel Whitaker. Samuel owned a small woodworking shop. He had no children, no family, no one. Arthur helped him for nearly 2 years. During that time, the two became close, like grandfather and grandson. Then Samuel became ill, very ill. Before his death, he entrusted Arthur with something, a collection of journals, personal records, and one final request. Arthur was never to reveal their contents until after both men were gone. Margaret read each line twice, then 3 times. The story felt impossible, yet the handwriting belonged to Arthur, without question. According to the letter, Samuel Whitaker wasn't merely a carpenter. For decades, he secretly designed handcrafted furniture that became famous among wealthy collectors. But he never sold under his own name. He used aliases, middlemen, private commissions. He preferred anonymity. Over time, his work became extraordinarily valuable. Samuel recorded everything in detailed journals, every design, every sale, every client, every hidden piece. Hidden piece. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She continued reading. Near the end of Samuel's life, several unfinished projects remained scattered in locations known only to him. One item in particular was mentioned repeatedly, a handcrafted wooden chest called the Sparrow Box. Samuel believed it was his finest creation. Its whereabouts remained unknown. Many collectors searched for it. None ever found it. Arthur wrote that the journals contained clues, dozens of clues, and according to Samuel, whoever eventually found the Sparrow Box would inherit something far more valuable than the box itself. Margaret blinked. The words seemed absurd, like the plot of a novel. Not real life. Certainly not her life. Then she reached the final paragraph. For years I thought about searching. I never did. Life became busy, then beautiful, then full of you. I stopped caring about treasure because I already had everything I wanted. But if you're ever reading this during difficult times, perhaps this story has found you for a reason. Whatever happens, remember this. Some doors only appear after others close. Love always. Arthur. Margaret lowered the letter. The room was silent. She didn't know what to think. Part of her wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to cry. Treasure? Hidden clues? A missing wooden chest? It sounded ridiculous. And yet, Arthur wasn't a man who invented stories. If he wrote it, he believed it. That evening, she found the journals. They were hidden beneath the remaining documents. 6 thick notebooks, hundreds of handwritten pages. Sketches filled the margins. Maps, measurements, observations, names, dates, symbols. Margaret spent hours reading, then days, then weeks. The more she learned about Samuel Whitaker, the stranger the story became. The journals revealed a brilliant craftsman obsessed with puzzles. Nothing he created was simple. Every project contained secrets, hidden compartments, encoded messages, layers beneath layers. One journal repeatedly referenced the Sparrow Box, never directly, always through riddles. A sparrow remembers where the river forgets. The 5th tree watches what the first 4 hide. Look where morning arrives before sunlight. Margaret copied the clues onto separate sheets of paper. She told no one, not Emily, not neighbors, not friends. Who would believe her? Some evenings she felt foolish, a 76-year-old woman chasing mysteries hidden inside dusty journals. Yet something inside her had awakened. For the first time in months, she woke each morning with purpose. Questions pulled her forward. Possibilities, hope. You might wonder why she didn't simply dismiss the entire thing. After all, most people would. Most people would assume the story was nonsense. But grief changes the way we see the world. When you've already lost almost everything, impossible things no longer seem quite so impossible. One afternoon, Margaret noticed something peculiar. A sketch inside the third journal resembled a building. Not just any building, a library. Specifically, the old library where she volunteered years earlier. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. The next morning she visited. The building looked exactly as she remembered. Tall windows, stone walls, a weathered clock above the entrance. Margaret wandered slowly through the reading rooms. Nothing seemed unusual until she reached the garden behind the building. There stood 5 enormous oak trees. 5. Her heart skipped. The 5th tree watches what the first 4 hide. The clue echoed inside her mind. Margaret approached the trees. Rain-soaked leaves rustled overhead. Birds chirped. Wind moved through branches. She examined roots, trunks, ground. Nothing. Then she noticed a small brass plaque attached to the 5th tree. Most visitors would never look twice. The plaque appeared decorative, meaningless, yet etched into one corner was a tiny symbol, a sparrow. The exact sparrow Samuel drew repeatedly throughout his journals. Margaret's breath caught. Her hands trembled. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. For several moments, she simply stared. The symbol felt like a voice reaching across generations, a whisper from a man dead for decades. You are getting closer. That night, she barely slept. The next morning, she returned carrying a notebook. She studied the area carefully, measured distances, compared sketches, followed clues. Hours passed. Nothing. Then late in the afternoon, she noticed sunlight striking a stone wall at a peculiar angle. A narrow beam illuminated a single carved mark hidden behind ivy. Another sparrow, smaller, nearly invisible, and beneath it, 3 numbers, 17, 18, 19. Margaret stared at them. A code, another clue, another door opening. And somewhere beyond that door waited a truth she could not yet imagine. A truth connected not only to Samuel Whitaker, not only to Arthur, but somehow, impossibly, to her own life. And that perhaps was the moment everything truly began. For the next several days, the numbers occupied every corner of Margaret's mind. 17, 4, 22. She wrote them on scraps of paper. She carried them in her purse. She woke up thinking about them and fell asleep wondering what they meant. The mystery had become more than a distraction. It had become a lifeline. For the first time since losing her home, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. Hope can arrive in strange disguises. Sometimes it arrives as a person, sometimes as an opportunity, and sometimes as 3 numbers carved into stone. One rainy afternoon, Margaret sat inside the library studying old records. The building contained archives dating back more than a century. Dusty shelves stretched across quiet rooms where history slept beneath layers of paper and time. The librarian on duty recognized her immediately. "Margaret," the woman said with a smile, "it's good to see you back." Margaret smiled. It's good to be back. That was the truth. For a few hours each day, surrounded by books and stories, she almost felt like herself again. She spent hours searching for connections between the numbers and the library's history. At first, she found nothing. Then something unusual appeared. An old floor plan, dated 62 years earlier. The building had once contained sections that no longer existed. Storage rooms, maintenance corridors, unused spaces sealed during renovations. One particular notation caught her attention. Room 17, shelf 4, box 22. Margaret froze. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she traced the faded writing with her fingertip. Room 17, shelf 4, box 22. The numbers, the exact numbers. For a moment she simply sat there staring. Then she carefully folded the document and approached the archive supervisor. After a polite conversation and several signed forms, permission was granted to inspect older storage records. The process took hours, then another day, then 2. Finally, a maintenance worker escorted her into a forgotten section beneath the building. The air smelled of dust and old wood. Dim lights flickered overhead. Concrete walls stretched into shadows. Margaret followed the worker through narrow hallways until they reached a locked storage area. The worker consulted a clipboard. Room 17, he said. Margaret's heart pounded. Inside stood rows of shelves. Most were empty. Many boxes had been removed decades ago. But near the far corner sat a single wooden crate marked with faded lettering. Box 22. The worker helped lower it. Dust rose into the air. Margaret's hands trembled. The crate wasn't large, perhaps 2 feet wide. Simple, unremarkable, yet something about it felt important. Very important. Inside were old documents, maps, accounting records, newspapers. At first glance, nothing special. Then beneath a stack of papers, she found a small carved wooden sparrow, exactly like the symbols from the journals. Her breath caught. Attached to the bird was a folded note. The handwriting belonged to Samuel Whitaker. If you found this, then curiosity still survives. Good, you'll need it. Margaret carefully unfolded the paper. A short message followed. Not directions, not explanations. Another clue. The river remembers what people forget. Find the bridge that never crossed water. Margaret stared at the words. Confusion mixed with excitement. The worker beside her looked puzzled. Everything okay? Yes, Margaret replied softly. I think so. But she wasn't sure. Not anymore. The mystery was growing larger. Much larger. The following week became a whirlwind of research. Bridge that never crossed water. What did that even mean? Margaret searched old newspapers, maps, town records, historical photographs. Then one evening, while studying images from decades earlier, she discovered something fascinating. Long before the town expanded, an abandoned railway line passed through the area. Part of the route included an elevated crossing locals nicknamed the Dry Bridge. Despite its name, no river existed beneath it, only fields. The bridge crossed nothing, the bridge that never crossed water. Margaret nearly laughed aloud. Samuel had hidden clues inside history itself. The next morning, she traveled to the location. The journey required 2 buses and a long walk. Her knees protested every step. Cold wind tugged at her coat, but she kept moving. The bridge still stood, old, weathered, forgotten. Wild grass surrounded rusted supports. Birds nested beneath broken beams. Most people passed without noticing it. Margaret climbed slowly, carefully. When she reached the center, she stopped. Silence surrounded her. No traffic, no voices, only wind. Then she noticed something carved into the railing. A sparrow. Another one. Beneath it were 4 words. Look below where shadows meet. Margaret leaned over the edge. At first, she saw nothing. Then sunlight shifted. A shadow moved. And there, hidden among the support beams, she spotted a small metal box. Her heart raced. Minutes later, after considerable effort, she managed to retrieve it. Inside waited another note, and a key, a small brass key, worn smooth with age. Alongside it lay a photograph. Margaret stared. The image showed Samuel Whitaker standing beside a young woman. The photograph was old, very old, yet the woman's face felt strangely familiar. Margaret frowned. She looked again, and again, a chill ran through her. The resemblance wasn't slight, it was extraordinary. The woman looked exactly like Margaret's grandmother. Exactly. The same eyes, the same smile, the same shape of face. Margaret's hands shook. Impossible. Her grandmother had died decades earlier. Surely many people resembled one another, yet deep inside she knew. This felt different, much different. That evening she compared the photograph to family pictures she still possessed. The similarities were undeniable. She barely slept. Questions multiplied. Who was the woman? Why was she with Samuel? How were they connected? Most importantly, why had no one ever mentioned him? The answers arrived 3 days later. Inside the fifth journal, a section Margaret had previously overlooked, tucked between pages, was a folded family record. Names, dates, relationships. And there, written clearly in Samuel's handwriting, was a revelation that left her speechless. The woman in the photograph wasn't merely someone who resembled her grandmother. She was her grandmother. Her real grandmother, not the woman Margaret had known. Another woman. A woman whose existence had been hidden from the family for generations. Margaret sat frozen. Her mind struggled to understand. According to Samuel's notes, decades earlier, a tragedy had torn apart several families. Children were separated. Records were altered. Lives changed. One infant girl had been raised under a different identity. That child eventually became Margaret's mother. The room seemed to tilt. She removed her glasses. Read the page again. Then again, the words never changed. Samuel Whitaker wasn't a stranger connected by coincidence. He was family. Not distant family, direct family. Margaret covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. All her life, she believed she knew where she came from, who she was, what her family's story looked like. Now, the foundation beneath those beliefs was cracking. Samuel had spent decades searching for the descendants of that lost child, but circumstances prevented him from revealing the truth publicly. Instead, he recorded everything. Every document, every piece of evidence, every proof. Then he hid the records behind layers of clues, waiting, trusting that eventually someone would find them, someone connected to the story, someone like Margaret. For several minutes she sat perfectly still. The apartment around her faded, the parking lot disappeared, the noise of the outside world vanished. Only one thought remained. Arthur knew. All those years, Arthur knew. Not everything, but enough to leave her the journals, enough to believe she would someday discover the truth herself. Margaret cried that night, not from sadness, not entirely. The tears came from something harder to describe, a feeling of standing between two lives. The life she thought she understood, and the life waiting behind hidden doors. By morning, another realization emerged. If Samuel truly had no surviving heirs except through this hidden family line, then everything connected to him might legally belong to that family, including the sparrow box, including whatever inheritance Samuel had concealed. Margaret immediately dismissed the thought. It sounded ridiculous. Wishful thinking. Life wasn't a fairy tale. People didn't lose everything and suddenly discover secret fortunes. That happened in books, not reality. Yet the evidence continued growing. Document after document. Record after record. Each one pointing toward the same astonishing possibility. Still, the greatest surprise was yet to come, because the sparrow box itself remained missing. And hidden inside that box was a final secret so extraordinary that even Samuel never wrote it down completely. Instead, he left only one final sentence. One sentence that haunted Margaret for days. The box does not contain the treasure. The box reveals it. And somewhere, waiting patiently after half a century of silence, the sparrow box was closer than anyone imagined. The sentence followed Margaret everywhere. The box does not contain the treasure. The box reveals it. She repeated the words while making tea, while riding buses, while lying awake at night staring into darkness. The more she thought about them, the stranger they seemed. If the box did not contain the treasure, then what exactly was everyone searching for? And why had Samuel devoted so much of his life to hiding it? A week passed, then another. Margaret continued studying the journals. Every clue, every sketch, every note written in the margins. Sometimes she felt she was getting closer. Other times she felt completely lost. Yet she refused to quit. There was too much at stake now. Not simply money, not even the mystery itself. This had become something personal, a connection to family she never knew existed, a connection to Arthur, a connection to a forgotten chapter of her own story. One afternoon, she noticed a detail she had overlooked dozens of times. Inside one journal, Samuel had drawn a rough sketch of a house. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. A front porch, 2 windows, a chimney, nothing unusual. But beneath the drawing he had written 4 words. The last key stays home. Margaret stared. Home. Whose home? Samuel's? Her grandmother's? Some other location entirely? Then she noticed something else. The sketch looked familiar, painfully familiar. Her pulse quickened. She turned several pages, found another sketch, then another. Suddenly realization struck. The house wasn't Samuel's. It wasn't a mystery location. It was her old house, the house she had lost, the house she and Arthur lived in for nearly 50 years. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. No, she whispered. She compared the drawing to old photographs. The porch matched. The windows matched. Even the position of the rose garden matched. Arthur had hidden clues there. For years, maybe decades, and she had never noticed. The discovery filled her with equal parts excitement and heartbreak because she no longer owned the house. A young family had purchased it months earlier. The idea of returning made her nervous. What would she even say? Hello, I used to live here, and I think there may be clues hidden somewhere on your property. The thought seemed absurd. Yet the journals pointed there, again and again. Eventually, curiosity won. 2 days later, she found herself standing across the street from the house. The afternoon sky was pale blue. Children's toys sat in the yard. A bicycle rested near the porch. The roses Arthur planted still bloomed. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. For a moment, she simply stood there, remembering, listening. The house looked alive, happy, loved. That comforted her more than she expected. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached. A young woman answered the door. Margaret introduced herself, explained that she had once owned the home. The woman's face immediately softened. "Oh," she said warmly, "you're Margaret." Margaret blinked. "You know my name?" The woman smiled. "The neighbors talk about you all the time. They say you baked the best pies in town." Margaret laughed softly. The sound surprised even her. It had been a while since laughter came easily. After a brief conversation, she explained the situation. Not every detail, just enough. To her surprise, the young woman didn't seem skeptical. She seemed fascinated. Within minutes, she invited Margaret inside. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a dream. Everything was different, and yet everything remained the same. The walls had new paint. Furniture had changed, but memories lingered. Margaret could almost hear Emily laughing as a little girl, could almost see Arthur carrying groceries through the kitchen, For a moment, grief returned, sharp and sudden, then passed. The young woman led her through the house. Margaret compared rooms to Samuel's sketches. Nothing. Then she stepped onto the porch. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, and suddenly she noticed something. One of the wooden porch columns contained a tiny carved sparrow. Her heart nearly stopped. It was hidden so carefully that no one would ever notice unless they were specifically looking for it. Margaret ran her fingers across the carving. Beneath it was a small removable wooden panel. The panel blended perfectly with the column. Arthur must have installed it himself. Carefully, she removed it. Inside rested a brass lock. And suddenly she remembered the key from the metal box beneath the bridge. Her hands shook. The young woman watched silently. Margaret inserted the key, turned it. A soft click echoed. The hidden compartment opened. Inside sat a wooden chest, no larger than a shoebox, beautifully crafted. Dark polished wood, intricate carvings, a single sparrow carved into the lid. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Margaret stared, unable to breathe, unable to think. After decades of secrets, after months of searching, after losing everything, there it was, the sparrow box. The young woman whispered first, "My goodness." Margaret nodded slowly. Tears filled her eyes. Yes. Her voice barely emerged. "That's it?" The box felt surprisingly heavy. They carried it inside and placed it on the dining table. Margaret sat staring at it. Part of her was afraid to open it. Because mysteries are powerful things. Sometimes the possibility feels larger than the answer. What if nothing was inside? What if everything had been a misunderstanding? What if she had spent months chasing shadows? Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside lay several objects. Documents, letters, a velvet pouch, and a sealed envelope bearing her name. Not Margaret. Another name. Her mother's name? Margaret froze. The room seemed to disappear. Everything narrowed to that envelope. Carefully, she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from Samuel. The letter revealed the truth at last. Decades earlier, Samuel's daughter had fallen in love with a young man her family disapproved of. Circumstances turned tragic. An accident. A separation. A child placed into another household during a time of confusion and loss. That child was Margaret's mother. Samuel spent years searching. By the time he discovered what happened, revealing the truth would have destroyed multiple families. So he remained silent, watching from a distance, protecting everyone involved. Yet he never stopped caring, never stopped hoping, never stopped leaving a path back home. Margaret's tears fell onto the paper. All her life, she believed parts of her story were missing. Now she understood why. But the greatest revelation wasn't in the letter. It was inside the velvet pouch. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Several gemstones sparkled beneath the light. Not many, but enough to suggest considerable value. Alongside them rested certificates, ownership records, investment documents, property holdings, assets Samuel accumulated quietly over decades. Preserved, protected, waiting. Margaret stared in disbelief. The figures written on the documents seemed impossible. She checked them twice, then 3 times. The amounts exceeded anything she had imagined. Far beyond enough to solve her financial problems. Far beyond enough to recover what she lost. Far beyond enough to change everything. Yet, strangely, that wasn't what affected her most. The money shocked her, but the letters broke her heart. There were dozens. Letters Samuel had written to his lost descendants. Letters never sent. Letters describing birthdays he missed, milestones he imagined, lives he hoped were happy, love carried across decades, love with nowhere to go. Margaret read until evening, then night, then long after darkness covered the town. And for the first time in many years, she cried, not from grief, but from feeling loved by someone she never had the chance to know. Still, despite all the evidence before her, a voice inside whispered the same thing. This cannot be real. This cannot possibly be happening. The next chapter of her life was standing directly in front of her. Yet Margaret Hale found herself unable to take a single step toward it. Because after losing so much, hope itself had become frightening. And believing this miracle might prove harder than surviving the loss that came before it. For several days after discovering the sparrow box, Margaret moved through life as though she were walking inside a dream. Everything looked normal. The same apartment, the same parking lot, the same kettle whistling every morning, the same grocery store, the same neighbors, yet nothing felt the same. The documents remained locked inside a drawer beside her bed. Every morning she checked to make sure they were still there. Every evening she checked again. Part of her expected them to disappear, to dissolve like morning fog, to reveal themselves as some misunderstanding, some mistake, some elaborate coincidence. After all, life had spent months teaching her not to trust good news. Loss had become familiar. Hope had not. 3 nights after finding the box, she sat alone at her kitchen table, holding one of Samuel's letters. Rain tapped gently against the window. Steam rose from her tea. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Not because of the inheritance, not because of the money, because of the loneliness between the lines. Samuel had loved people he never truly knew. He had carried that love for decades, quietly, faithfully, patiently. One letter described the birthday he imagined his granddaughter might have enjoyed at age 10. Another described the pride he would feel if she learned to read. Another simply said, "I hope someone tells you that you matter." Margaret read that sentence again, then once more. Something inside her cracked. Not painfully, gently, like ice beginning to melt after a long winter. For months she had felt invisible, forgotten, discarded. Now a man she never met was reaching across generations to tell her she mattered, and somehow it felt exactly like what her heart needed to hear. The following Sunday she called Emily. For nearly an hour she said nothing about the discovery. They discussed ordinary things. The weather, Emily's children, school activities, a leaking faucet, safe topics, normal topics. Finally, Emily noticed something. "Mom? Waf? Off?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes? What's going on?" Margaret smiled despite herself. "What do you mean?" "You sound different." Different. The word lingered. Perhaps she did. Perhaps carrying a miracle in your pocket changes your voice. Margaret took a slow breath. "Emily, I need to tell you something." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours. At first, Emily thought her mother was joking. Then she thought she had misunderstood. Then she became silent, very silent. Margaret could almost hear her trying to process everything. The journals, the clues, the photographs, the family connection, the inheritance, the sparrow box, all of it sounded unbelievable. Because it was unbelievable. Finally, Emily spoke. "Mom." "Yes?" "Are you absolutely sure?" Margaret glanced toward the drawer. The documents rested inside, real, solid, waiting. "No," she admitted honestly. "I'm not sure of anything anymore." The line remained quiet. Then Emily laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because sometimes astonishment has nowhere else to go. "I think I need to come visit." Margaret smiled. "I think I'd like that." 2 days later, Emily arrived. The moment she stepped into the apartment, she wrapped her mother in a hug so tight Margaret could barely breathe. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Sometimes love says everything without words. They spent the next day reviewing documents, letters, certificates, records, evidence, piece by piece, hour by hour. Slowly, Emily's disbelief faded, then transformed into wonder. "My goodness," she whispered repeatedly. "My goodness." Margaret understood exactly how she felt. That evening, they sat together drinking tea. The documents lay spread across the table. Neither woman touched them. Instead, they sat quietly, thinking, processing, feeling. Finally, Emily looked at her mother. "What are you going to do?" Margaret stared into her cup. The question should have been simple. It wasn't, not even close. "I don't know. You could get your house back. I know. You could pay everything off. I know. You could finally stop worrying." Margaret nodded. "I know." Emily frowned gently. "Then why do you sound afraid?" The question landed directly in the center of Margaret's heart, because she was afraid, terrified, not of losing everything. She had already survived that. She was afraid of believing, afraid of trusting happiness, afraid of opening her heart to possibility only to watch it disappear. Again, life had taught her painful lessons. People often discuss courage as though it means facing danger, but sometimes courage means believing good things can happen after terrible ones. Sometimes hope is the bravest choice of all. Margaret stared out the window. The parking lot lights glowed against darkness. "I got used to expecting disappointment," she said quietly. Emily reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You shouldn't have had to." Margaret smiled sadly. "Maybe not, but it happened." The next few weeks became a whirlwind of meetings. Lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, historians, researchers. People arrived carrying folders and briefcases, questions and answers, proof and verification. Again and again, the evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The inheritance was legitimate. The family connection was legitimate. Everything was legitimate. Yet, Margaret still struggled to believe it. One afternoon, she sat across from a financial advisor nearly half her age. The woman reviewed figures calmly, professionally, confidently. Numbers Margaret could scarcely comprehend. Finally, the advisor smiled. "Mrs. Hale, your financial difficulties are over." Such a simple sentence. 9 words. Yet Margaret felt tears gathering immediately. Not because of the money, because someone had finally said the words she never expected to hear. "Your difficulties are over." For months, she had survived one day at a time, one bill at a time, one worry at a time. Now someone was telling her she could stop surviving. She could start living again. The idea felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Outside the office, she sat on a bench and cried quietly. Passers-by walked past. Cars moved through traffic. The world continued. Yet for Margaret, everything had changed. Still, not everyone responded positively. A distant relative questioned the inheritance. Several people expressed skepticism. Others hinted that Margaret must have manipulated circumstances somehow. The accusations hurt more than she expected. One evening, a former acquaintance confronted her directly. "I find all this very convenient," the woman said. Margaret stared. Convenient? People don't just discover secret fortunes. Margaret felt anger rise. Not loud anger. The quiet kind, the dangerous kind, the kind born from exhaustion. "No," she replied softly. "They usually don't." The woman crossed her arms. "So you expect everyone to believe this story?" Margaret considered the question, then surprised herself with her answer. "I don't need everyone to believe it." For a moment, both women stood silent. Margaret realized something important. For months, she had measured her worth through loss. The house she lost, the money she lost, the security she lost. Now she was beginning to understand that none of those things defined her. Never had, never would. That realization felt more valuable than anything hidden inside the sparrow box. The legal challenges eventually disappeared. Evidence resolved doubts. Records confirmed facts. The truth stood firm, yet the greatest battle remained inside Margaret herself. Every night she wrestled with the same question. What now? Not what happened. Not what she inherited. What now? Because money solves many problems, but it doesn't automatically provide purpose. Purpose must be chosen, built, lived, and Margaret had spent so long surviving that she no longer remembered what dreams looked like. Then one evening she found another letter from Samuel, a letter she had somehow overlooked. Inside was a sentence underlined twice. We are not measured by what we keep. We are measured by what we give away. Margaret read those words repeatedly. The sentence followed her to bed, followed her into dreams, followed her into the next morning. And somewhere between sunrise and breakfast, an idea appeared. Small at first, barely visible, then stronger, clearer, brighter. An idea that had nothing to do with wealth, everything to do with purpose. By the time she finished her morning tea, Margaret Hale knew exactly what she wanted to do next. And for the first time in many years, the future didn't frighten her. It invited her. The idea stayed with Margaret all day. It followed her through meetings, through phone calls, through paperwork. By evening, it had become impossible to ignore. For months, she had focused on what she lost. Now she found herself thinking about people who were losing things every day. People sitting alone in small apartments. People counting coins before buying groceries. People wondering whether anyone remembered them. People exactly like the woman she had been only a short time earlier. She understood their pain because she had lived it. Every sleepless night. Every silent meal. Every moment of uncertainty. She knew what it felt like when the world moved on without you. And she knew something else. Many people never found their way back. That realization settled deep inside her heart. The next morning, she called Emily. I've made a decision. Emily laughed softly. I had a feeling you would. What makes you say that? Because whenever you make up your mind about something, your voice changes. Margaret smiled. Apparently, some things never changed. So what are you going to do? Margaret looked out the window. Sunlight spilled across the parking lot. The day felt bright, promising. I'm going to help people. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said the words Margaret needed to hear. I think that's exactly what you should do. Over the following weeks, Margaret worked harder than she had in years. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. For the first time in a very long time, she woke each morning with purpose. The inheritance solved her financial problems quickly. Her debts disappeared. Her savings were restored. Yet she discovered something surprising. The relief felt wonderful, but purpose felt even better. Money had removed fear. Purpose brought joy. Using part of Samuel's inheritance, Margaret created a small community foundation dedicated to helping elderly people facing hardship. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, just practical help. Rent assistance, food support, transportation, companionship, resources, simple acts of kindness. The things that often mean everything when life becomes difficult. When people asked why she was doing it, she always gave the same answer. Because someone helped me. The answer was true, even if the someone happened to be a man she never met. Word spread quickly. The town embraced the project. Volunteers appeared. Donations arrived. Local businesses offered support. People who had never spoken before began working together. Margaret watched it happen with amazement. Kindness, she discovered, was contagious. One person started. Another followed. Then another, then dozens more. Soon the foundation outgrew its small office. Margaret found herself attending meetings, organizing events, and speaking with people almost daily. At 76 years old, she was somehow busier than she had been at 50, yet she felt more alive than she had in years. One afternoon, she received a letter, a real letter, handwritten, the old-fashioned kind she loved. Inside was a short message from an elderly widow named Rose. Margaret had never met her. The letter explained that foundation assistants had allowed Rose to remain in her apartment after facing eviction. Without help, she would have lost everything. At the bottom of the page was a single sentence. "You gave me hope when I had none left." Margaret sat quietly after reading it. Tears filled her eyes, not dramatic tears, gentle tears. The kind that arrive when your heart recognizes something important. Months earlier, those same words could have described her. Now someone else was saying them, and somehow the circle felt complete. As the foundation grew, Margaret made another decision, a deeply personal one. She wanted to see her old house again, not as a visitor, not as someone remembering what she lost, as someone grateful for what it gave her. The young family still lived there. When Margaret contacted them, they welcomed her warmly. On a bright spring afternoon, she walked through the property once more. The roses bloomed brilliantly. Red and pink blossoms swayed in the breeze. Children laughed in the yard. The house felt full of life, exactly as it should. As she stood near the garden, the young woman who owned the house joined her. "I have a question." Margaret smiled. "All right, if you wanted to buy it back, we'd sell." Margaret looked at the house, the porch, the windows, the memories. For a moment, she imagined living there again, returning to familiar rooms, reclaiming what she lost. Months earlier, she would have accepted instantly. Now she surprised herself. She shook her head. The young woman looked confused. "You don't want it back?" Margaret glanced toward the children playing beneath Arthur's roses. Then she smiled. No, the answer felt peaceful, certain, complete. This house already has a family. The young woman squeezed her hand. Neither said anything more. Nothing else needed saying. Driving home that evening, Margaret realized something profound. She no longer wanted her old life back. Not because it wasn't beautiful. It had been. But because she had grown beyond it. The woman who lost everything no longer existed. The woman sitting in the car was someone new. Not younger, not richer, stronger. The final obstacle arrived unexpectedly. Nearly a year after discovering the sparrow box, Margaret experienced a serious health scare. One morning, she collapsed while preparing breakfast. Suddenly, without warning. The next thing she remembered was opening her eyes in a hospital room. Machines beeped softly nearby. Sunlight filtered through curtains. Emily sat beside the bed holding her hand. Fear flickered through Margaret. Old fear. The familiar fear of losing everything again. The doctor explained that her heart required treatment. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to demand attention. For several days, Margaret lay awake considering the fragile nature of life. How quickly everything could change. How easily plans could disappear. The experience humbled her, but it also clarified something. She had spent months helping others prepare for tomorrow. Now she needed to appreciate today. When she finally returned home, she adjusted her schedule. Less rushing, more living, more time with Emily and her grandchildren, more mornings watching birds, more evenings enjoying sunsets. Purpose remained important, but so did joy. One cannot replace the other. The foundation continued growing. New programs appeared. More people received help. Margaret became something of a local legend, though she disliked the attention. Whenever newspapers requested interviews, she tried redirecting focus toward volunteers, toward community, toward kindness itself. "People keep telling my story," she once said. "They should tell theirs. They're the ones changing lives." Yet everyone knew the truth. Without Margaret, none of it would exist. Years passed. Not many, but enough. Enough for wounds to heal. Enough for new memories to form. Enough for happiness to become familiar again. One autumn afternoon, Margaret visited the library where the journey began. The oak trees still stood. Their leaves glowed gold beneath afternoon sunlight. She sat on a nearby bench and watched them sway gently. A young boy wandered past, carrying a stack of books nearly as tall as he was. An elderly man smiled while reading beneath a tree. Birds hopped across the grass. Ordinary moments, beautiful moments. Margaret thought about Samuel, about Arthur, about all the strange events that brought her here. Then she smiled, because she finally understood the real treasure had never been hidden inside a box. The treasure was what the box revealed about people. Love that survives generations. Hope that survives hardship. Kindness that survives loss. Those things were priceless. And unlike money, they only grow when shared. As the afternoon sun warmed her face, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Deep, steady, complete. The kind of peace that arrives when your heart finally understands its purpose. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all. Not the inheritance, not the discoveries, not even the second chance. The gift was learning that life could still surprise her, even after 76 years, especially after 76 years. Several years later, on a quiet spring morning, Margaret sat on the porch of a small cottage she had chosen for herself. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious, but it felt like home. A garden stretched across the front yard, alive with color. Roses climbed along a white fence. Wind chimes swayed gently in the breeze. Birds gathered near a feeder hanging from an old oak branch. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the open window. Margaret wrapped a light blanket around her shoulders and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. These moments had become precious, not because they were rare, because she finally understood how quickly they could disappear. A framed photograph rested on the table beside her. Arthur smiled from the picture exactly as he always had. Kind eyes, crooked grin. The face of a man who somehow still felt present despite being gone for so many years. Margaret reached over and touched the frame. "Well," she whispered softly, "you were right." The morning breeze carried her words away. For a moment she imagined him laughing. She imagined him standing beside the roses, dirt on his hands, pretending not to be proud of the garden he secretly adored. The thought made her smile. Loss never completely leaves us. The people we love become part of us, part of our memories, part of our stories, part of the way we see the world. The pain softens, but the love remains. That, perhaps, is one of life's quiet miracles. Later that afternoon, Margaret attended a gathering organized by the foundation. Dozens of people filled the community hall. Some were volunteers. Some were families who had received help. Some were elderly men and women who simply wanted companionship and connection. Laughter echoed through the room. Conversations overlapped. Children ran between tables. Life filled every corner. Margaret moved slowly through the crowd, greeting familiar faces. A widow whose rent had been saved. A retired teacher who received transportation assistance. A grandfather who found friendship after years of isolation. Each person carried a story. Each story mattered. At one point, a young reporter approached her. By now, many people knew who Margaret Hale was, not because of the inheritance, because of what she chose to do with it. The reporter smiled. "Mrs. Hale, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you could go back and change everything that happened, would you?" The question caught her by surprise. For a long moment, she didn't answer. The room buzzed around her. Voices, laughter, music, life. She thought about Arthur's death. The debt, the fear, the apartment, the loneliness, the nights she cried herself to sleep, the day she nearly gave up. Then she looked around the hall. She looked at the people smiling, the friendships formed, the lives touched, the hope restored. Finally, she answered, "No." The reporter blinked. "No?" Margaret shook her head gently. "There was a time when I would have changed everything." She paused. "There was a time I would have erased every painful day." The room seemed quieter somehow. People nearby listened, not because she was famous, because pain is something everyone understands. "But now," Margaret continued softly, "now I know those painful days led me here." The reporter remained silent. Margaret smiled. Sometimes life breaks the path you're walking because there's another one you're meant to find. The young reporter lowered her notebook. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she simply said, "Thank you." As evening approached, the gathering slowly ended. People hugged goodbye. Chairs were folded. Lights dimmed. Margaret stepped outside alone. The sun was setting. The sky glowed orange and purple across the horizon. Beautiful, quiet, timeless. She sat on a bench and watched the colors deepen. A familiar feeling settled over her. Gratitude. Not for the money, not for the inheritance, not even for the extraordinary mystery that changed her life. She felt grateful for the ordinary things. Morning coffee, birdsong, family, friendship, second chances, the simple privilege of waking up and discovering there was still more life ahead. Years earlier, when she sat alone in that tiny apartment with $17 in her wallet, she believed her story was ending. She believed the best parts were behind her. She believed she had become a footnote in a world that no longer needed her. How wrong she had been. You might be wondering why stories like Margaret's matter. After all, most people will never discover hidden journals. Most people will never uncover secret inheritances. Most people will never find a treasure hidden inside a wooden box. But that was never really the point. The treasure was never the money. The treasure was the reminder that life is not finished simply because it becomes difficult. The reminder that purpose can arrive when we least expect it. The reminder that a chapter ending is not the same thing as a story ending. Margaret learned that lesson at 76 years old. Some people learn it sooner, some learn it later, but whenever it arrives, it changes everything. The following spring, Margaret visited the library once more. The oak trees stood exactly where they always had. Strong, patient, enduring. She walked to the fifth tree, the tree that watched what the first four hid, the tree that started it all. Sunlight filtered through the branches above. Birds sang overhead. Margaret rested her hand against the bark. For a moment, she closed her eyes. And in that moment, she thought about every version of herself. The young woman who fell in love. The wife, the mother, the widow, the woman who lost everything, the woman who found herself again. Each version had suffered. Each version had hoped. Each version had carried her to this place. When she opened her eyes, a small sparrow landed on a nearby branch. It tilted its head as though studying her. Margaret laughed softly. The bird remained for a moment, then flew into the bright afternoon sky. She watched until it disappeared, and somehow it felt like a message. Not from Samuel, not from Arthur, from life itself. Keep going. There is always more ahead than you can see. Margaret smiled and began the walk home, slowly, comfortably, without hurry. because she finally understood something many people spend their entire lives trying to learn. Losing everything does not mean losing yourself. Sometimes the darkest seasons strip away everything except what truly matters. And when the storm finally passes, you discover that the strongest parts of you were there all along. Life has a strange way of hiding gifts inside its greatest hardships. And sometimes, when all seems lost, what you discover isn't a treasure waiting for you at the end of the road. It's the person you become while finding it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.